Hello and good evening all. I'm back from Sebring and replete with lots more photos with which to make lots more videos, whether you like it or not. Of course, assuming that you're watching this, especially the longer version, assume that you do like it, so thank you, and hope you'll stick around for quite a while to come, because there's a heck of a lot of cars left to talk about. While there were a number of wonderful entries at Sebring, as I discussed in my video about the entry list last week, the most exciting vehicle on track, certainly the most interesting one for me, at least of those which I've yet to make a video, was the 767B that Mazda themselves brought out after its restoration for the delight of our eyes and ears at both Daytona and Sebring this autumn. As I just mentioned, this is the longer form of the video, so if you're time crunched, want just the basic facts, or don't particularly like the sound of my voice, well, the other video is more for you. Actually, you can turn on closed captions, so you don't have to listen to me at all, so that might be fun. I don't know. Either way, if the last point carries through, sorry, I'm not going to pull a Harry Snapper organs performing Sancho Panza and do it in a high-pitched Welsh accent, or engage in too many abusive ad-libs unless it's about either myself or the Tower Motorsports team. Mazda has been participating in prototype racing, or had been participating in prototype racing, with moderate but unremarkable success since 1983, with GTP entries largely in the World and Japanese Sports Car Championship, starting with the 717C, which apocryphal sources indicate may have inspired the Yamaha OX99 from Oddity Week, but it could also just be a more general statement about Mazda's prototypes in general, or even just Group C/GTPs in general. They were developing new models on a generally annual basis, up the tens-digit designations, until the 767 appeared in 1988. I still haven't figured out exactly why Mazda went with the GTP rules in European and Japanese championships, well, actually in the European championships, but hey, that's what they went with, and they weren't turned away. The Japanese Sports Car Championship alternately pretty much took all comers, so that was on the level. Incidentally, the model designation 747 from the 7X7 range of Mazda prototypes was skipped because the designs kept coming out with a weird, smaller second seating area above the main chassis, and Juan Tripp's ghost continually appeared in designer Nigel Stroud's dreams, telling him to design airmail carriers instead. Odd, that. I tried to get an AI-generated image to match the description, but these are the best renders I got. Makes one feel a bit more comfortable about the rise of the machines, doesn't it? I mean, this one looks more like a Porsche 917 rather than a Group C car, for one thing. And, well, actually, as we progress through them, some of them aren't too bad, apart from Pani Lannom, which sounds more like a village in Siam, but I think this one's actually my favorite, although this one is probably the closest to what I was envisioning. Still, it's more generic Group C than having any particular styling cues that remind me of the 767 or 787 or any of the other Mazdas, but yeah, well. In actuality, the 747 model number was avoided because Mazda's internal designation for the second generation RX-7, which was in production at the same time, had already received the code 747. More sensible, but at the same time, the image of a Christmas Carol-esque visitation by Juan Tripp, founder of Pan Am World Airways for reference, amused me to no end, and I had to include it. So, actually, dear God, I've just had another horrifying extension of that thought, that maybe that's what drove Howard Hughes mad. He was the stand-in in our bizarre hypothetical here for Ebenezer Scrooge. We could have the Wright brothers, or even the Montgolfiers if we really wanted to get, or Count Zeppelin, as the ghost of air travel past. You had Juan Tripp as the ghost of air travel present, and then we had Michael O'Leary, as the CEO of Ryanair, as the specter of air travel future. I mean, can you imagine trying to explain a Ryanair flight to someone in the 1950s? You've got these horrifyingly cramped yellow plastic seats with blue fake leather, and they play a triumphant trumpet noise every time they land because that's the big achievement of the flight. I think it would have driven me insane as well at that point. Anyway, back to Mr. Stroud, without any night terrors of aviation magnates past, erstwhile present, or dystopian today. Nigel Stroud was indeed the designer on the 767 as a continuation of the 75 and of Mazda's development of their specialty, the Wankel rotary engine. Mazda actually started with rotary engines back when it launched the rather lovely-looking Cosmo road car in 1967, striking and, in my opinion, excellent blend of Ford Thunderbird, Alfa Giulietta, and maybe some Toyota 2000 GT in the front end, but in a more sensible, approachable way, which would make sense given that 2000 GT was, I think, quite a bit more expensive than the Cosmo and produced in far fewer numbers. The Mazda Wankels first showed up in motorsports in the 70s, sold for use in Chevron B16s, of all things, and between then and the 1980s, the complexity, power, and reliability of the engines had improved markedly. Okay, time for a quick overview of the whole rotary engine thing. As a disclaimer, I'm emphatically not an engineer, so this explanation is going to be rather general and may contain some minor inaccuracies based on my own misunderstandings or misconceptions, for which I'm sure I'll be kindly corrected in the comments. But as a PSA to parents whose children are reaching the age in which they may be interested in exploring alternative powertrain choices, hopefully this video can help you talk to your children about Wankels in an approachable, sensible way before they hear about them from a friend's older sibling or untrustworthy adult. I'm really hamming it up in this one, aren't I? Anyway, I say anyway too much as well, but there we are. In a normal reciprocating piston engine, like you find in most automobiles, fuel is injected into a combustion chamber, the cylinder, and set alight, which causes an explosion and pressure wave that drives the piston away from the source of the explosion and imparts its thrust to a crankshaft, which rotates and uses a motive force, either from a flywheel, the synchronized pressures from other pistons, or usually a combination, to return the piston to its more compressed position to be exploded at again. The crankshaft then turns this linear reciprocating motion into rotational motion, which in automotive applications then generally goes to a gearbox and then to one or more wheels, providing motion either forward or backward, depending on the gear selected. On the other hand, the rotary engine, developed and named for Felix Wankel, and later made commercially feasible by Hans-Dieter Paschke, has a combustion chamber that's nearly oval in shape, not quite, with a slight pinch in the middle to make it figure 8-esque shape called an epitrochoid. There's your vocab word for the week. I'll splash the description up on the side here. The original Wankel design was more complicated to manufacture and maintain, with the two nested rotors that both rotated around a central stationary shaft, but this design was plagued by overheating issues, even more than the early commercially viable designs, and difficulties in performing the routine maintenance tasks that might be necessary or would be necessary for commercial applications. Although, in contrast, it was staggeringly powerful for its size and capable of producing just shy of 30 horsepower at 22,000 RPM in, as best I can tell, something that's not that much bigger than a cantaloupe, muskmelon, whatever the heck they're called. Maybe a little bigger than that, but tiny motor to be producing 30 horsepower. 22,000 RPM doesn't quite get you to, jet turbine Howmet TX levels of revs, but it's still gosh darned impressive. In the modern version, we still have the epitrochoid and the triangular rotor, which divides the chamber into three unequally sized areas based on its position, and in the workable version, the internal rotor, rotates within the stationary combustion chamber, providing rotational motion to the inner eccentric shaft, which in turn holds the gearing for the rotor to complete its cycle through the combustion chamber. While it does appear in this helpful graphic, and in reality that the rotor is guided by making contact with the walls of the combustion chamber, and indeed it does have seals at the points of the rotor that touch against those walls, the gearing within the rotor and eccentric shaft actually provide the guidance, and the rotor itself never makes contact with the walls of the combustion chamber, at least in a motor that's working as intended. The standard 4-step process of intake, compression, ignition, and exhaust is preserved as in a standard reciprocating engine, but as the combustion chamber exists in what is essentially a multi-ordinal rather than a binary state, and the rotor has three sides, there are three rotations of the output shaft instead of two for each completion of the four-step process, which is called the Otto cycle. And as the rotor is rotating rather than reciprocating, and each face of the rotor experiences all aspects of the cycle, this actually doubles the power output on the drive shaft per instance of combustion. That is to say, while a piston has to return to the point of compression with the help of the aforementioned flywheel or other pistons, in a Wankel engine, the next face of the rotor is already getting splodied and provides the impetus to keep everything moving. Moreover, the rotational nature of the engine has the benefit of being much smoother than the push-me-pull-you cycle of a reciprocating engine, which thereby reduces engine vibration as well as facilitates higher theoretical revolution speed that becomes limited more by gear strength than stresses on the unit as a whole. A decent example of this in a reciprocating engine is if you lose a cylinder, the engine gets very unbalanced and really gets quite wobbly, and eventually if things get bad enough, it'll shake itself apart. All of this sounds quite lovely, both from a theoretical perspective and when it goes flying past you at turn 17 at many miles an hour. So why, then, I hear you cry with wailing eyes and gnashing elbows, do we not all have rotary-engined vehicles hither, tither, and yes, yon too? Well, in practical applications, there are still a number of issues. The design generally heats unevenly, and while this has been largely mitigated through improvements to the material science and the general design of a Wankel engine, it does require the use of somewhat more exotic materials than a conventional piston engine. Seals also tend to be far more critical and complex than on conventional engines, and even minor issues with them can lead to far quicker and more catastrophic failure as a result. They also aren't great for any applications that require moderate to high torque outputs. They're staggeringly fuel inefficient compared to conventional engines because the combustion cycle is abrogated effectively. It's shorter and therefore combustion's not as complete, and they do burn a good bit more oil than a conventional engine, which caused a lot of issues when the RX-8 became popular as a road car in the mid-2000s because people didn't realize you have to add more oil to a rotary engine than you do to a normal car. Not more oil more consistently. Anyway, the latter 2 points combine to create rather smoky downshifts, especially when they are just warming up their engines, like this shot from the RX-7 last weekend. Or, if at the end of this rather tedious and rambling explanation you have appetite for a metaphor, you can think of the piston engine as deriving its motive force from a pogo stick, up and down in a linear fashion from consistent directional power, while a Wankel engine is more like a bicycle, albeit one with rounded triangles for wheels. That is to say, in a Newtonian world where each action has an equal and opposite reaction, the pogo stick is confined to a binary state whereby the reaction must return precisely along the direction of travel, whereas our Wankel bicycle can leverage its 3 points of direction change, effectively, to make a more efficient use of those equal and opposite reactions through what I'm calling oblique dispersion of the reaction along its force-impacted plane. I'm sure I got some of those more detailed points at least slightly wrong, but the general mechanics should be correct, and again, clarifications are sure to spring up in the comments like mushrooms after a rainstorm. Now back to the 767. Mr. Stroud designed the 767 in cooperation with the in-house performance and racing division of Mazda, Mazda Speed. All of the 7X7 prototypes were powered by Wankel rotary engines from Mazda's 13 series, which had first debuted as the two-rotor 13B the previous decade, and saw use in a variety of road and sports cars up to the modern day, only going out of final production in 2012, with the end of the RX-8 I mentioned a few moments ago. The 13B first ran at Le Mans in an RX-7 in 1979 and was used in the 7X7 prototypes until the 737C in 1985. The 1986 version of the 757 debuted an enhanced three-rotor design, the 13G, although the dimensions and components of the two-rotor designs remained essentially the same, just multiplied by 1.5. The 767, when it came along, received the first four-rotor design, the 13J. Though comparatively long and heavy for a rotary engine, and when compared to the preceding 13G, it produced significantly more power and torque than the outgoing engine, making nearly 542 horsepower at 8,500 RPM and 390 pound-feet of torque at 7,000, with a red line of 9,000 RPM, creating the characteristic wailing high-end exhaust note and barking quick revs for which the Mazda prototypes are perhaps best remembered. The engine sent power to the rear wheels, paired with a 5-speed manual gearbox that was co-developed between Mazda and Porsche, making use of a Porsche base unit, which was subsequently modified to fit the unique rotary application for which it was destined. Interestingly, I did learn in the paddock this past weekend, or last weekend, I suppose, that the transmission, which I believe was also the transmission used in all three of the vehicles, but may have been the unit that was replaced and put in during its restoration, using a more modern Porsche unit, perhaps. Don't think that's the case, but couching myself in hypotheticals here. Was not a racing-typical sequential manual, but rather a road-derived gearbox with regular synchros and H-pattern shifter, which greatly improves drivability, if at a slight disadvantage to shifting speeds. I think that one of the videos that I took, you can actually hear the slower shifting versus what you might expect from a prototype being driven by someone who really knows what the heck they're doing. In fairness, given the opportunity, I'd take that trade-off in a heartbeat if it meant having a decent chance of being able to not embarrass myself too badly just trying to pull it out of the paddock. I've still not really managed to figure out how to drive an unsynchronized manual, which partly due to not having access to one, and partly because I'm terrified that I would end up having to replace all of the gearbox internals. I'm sure I'd still end up grinding the gears a little bit for other reasons, but it's embarrassing either way. The unconventionality of the 767's design actually pretty much ends there with the engine and transmission, as the drivetrain was encapsulated in an aluminum sheet and honeycomb monocoque with any non-structural body components made from carbon fiber and Kevlar. It's worth mentioning, actually, that due to the increased length of the new 13J four-rotor engine, the vehicle was lengthened relative to the 7.5, although in the last race of the 1987 season, a stretched version of the 757, called the 757E, did make an appearance for a shakedown race of the new 12J engine, E standing for, you guessed it, elongated. The 7.6 was lower than the 757, however, which improved their mid-corner aerodynamics and grip, and, in my opinion, also improved the aesthetics of the vehicle, which to me stands out as the best looking of the Mazda prototypes, definitely of that era, possibly better looking than the DPI. There's arguments to be made one way or the other on that one. I think the DPI in that deep burgundy, I think it's called Soul Crystal Red, might just pip it, but I do like it better than the 787 due to its lower and pointier nose, which may be heresy, but I'm sticking with it like a sticky wicket. Or something. Moving on, the cabin was typically sparse. You can actually note another instance of the right-hand drive, right-hand shifter combo. Suspension was double wishbones with coilover shocks that were sourced from Penske, although that may be a modern swap from a domestic Japanese brand that was used in period, as this one was restored and lives in the Atlanta area. So Penske's comparatively easy to get stuff from, I would imagine. The disc brakes come from Rays/Volk. I think they're better known these days for making wheels. Toyota has Rays wheels on their GR010 Le Mans hypercar, for instance. Steering with rack and pinion, all pretty standard sports prototype tech for the 1980s. Don't don't think I actually mentioned it yet. Double wishbones and not push rods. Oh, yeah, I mentioned coilovers. 100-liter or 26.4-gallon fuel tank completed the package, and all of this ended up weighing in at just 800 kilos or 1,764 pounds after adding the class-required level of ballast, which was actually slightly less than a contemporaneous Porsche 962 or Jag XJR9. The 767s had their competition debut at the 500 kilometers of Suzuka in April of 1988 as part of the Japanese Sports Car Championship, but not the World Sports Car Championship, or WSCC. One of the two 767s managed to cover the total distance and placed 7th overall, which, not bad for a new car, while the other retired from unspecified mechanical issues. I can't even figure out from some of the Google translated Japanese sources I checked out exactly what those mechanical issues were, although amusingly, the Japanese Wikipedia article on the 7.6 that I used as a starting point has competition translated as warring and its final race as its final battle. So, Bansai Tomoyo. A subsequent outing at Silverstone brought a class victory for the 767 entered in the battle, along with 9th overall, although the class victory does ring a bit hollow upon examination of the results, which reveals that Mazda was indeed the only one in the GTP class at all. I love how easy it becomes to win when you're only competing against yourself. Kind of puts me in mind of the last few minutes of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, when it's just Charlie left, so kind of he has to have won.
Nothing! You lose! Good day, sir!
The 1988 Le Mans outing, however, was a bit of a disappointment, with both cars suffering reliability issues around Circuit de la South. Specifically, I think both suffered from cracked manifolds and water pump failures. The Mazda team did have spares, and they were able to repair and get them back out on track to finish the race, but they lost a lot of time in the pits, and both 7.6s were classified behind the 757 that the Mazda team had entered as insurance against potential retirement of one or both of the new cars, with the 7.6s coming 17th and 19th overall in the standings, and the 7.5 took GTP class honors, again with only Mazda entries contesting the class. The rest of the season saw similar reliability issues, unfortunately, and since Mazda wasn't really up to building an entirely new prototype each year at that point, with the economy starting to get a little shaky and such programs an expensive proposition, Mazda Speed's remit for the off-season was threefold. They had to achieve further weight reduction, aerodynamic improvements, and a power increase. The 13J was revised significantly, shortening its length somewhat with a reworking of the cooling and electrical systems. Some aluminum components were replaced with lighter carbon fiber or carbon fiber/aluminum honeycomb pieces, and a variable diameter intake was fitted to improve low and mid-end torque. The exhaust system was redesigned, and the engine internals were reworked to improve reliability, especially paying attention to the seals. All of this led to the 767B for the 1989 season, the most notable aesthetic change coming in the form of the newly relocated side-mounted exhaust. The 767B rang in the new year in Florida, which, incidentally, I won't be doing this year, I think for the first time ever, with a pretty solid start to the 24 Hours of Daytona, finishing 5th overall and in class at the Tri-Oval. They returned to Suzuka, part of the World Sports Car Championship this year for some reason, and the season opener, finishing 17th overall for one car and with a gearbox-related retirement for the other. They came 10th at the Brands Hatch race in the lead-up to Le Mans, and first in class at both races, although, again, Mazda 767s were the only competitors. Le Mans saw 3 cars entered again, 2 767Bs, chassis 001 and 002, and a third in 767 form, comprising the only 3 chassis ever actually completed. No bonus points for guessing what the third chassis number is. While the cars saw improvements over the previous outing, things were still middling at best, with the cars coming 7th, 9th, and 12th in chassis number order, an outright victory remaining well beyond their grasp. They did make it 1, 2, 3 in class, however. Quelle surprise. The rest of the season, both at home in Japan and abroad, was somewhat underwhelming, and the new 787 made its appearance in 1990, with chassis 003, now you know the number, now in 767B guise, running as the insurance car at Le Mans for the newer prototypes. Both of the 787s failed to finish at the race that year, and the 76 suffered a variety of mechanicals as well, but managed to place 20th overall. One of the cars, I believe 002, but I could be wrong, was sold off to the Shizumatsuing, apologies to any Japanese speakers team, for Shizumatsuing team. Apologies to any Japanese speakers. They didn't have apologies to any Japanese speakers in their team name. I just realized that I flowed that together wrong. Anyway, for competition in the JSCC, but they had another pretty unimpressive season. Mazda retired the 767 at the end of 1990, and chassis 003 was also sold, racing without notable success as a privateer car for 2 years under the banner of Akaike Racing, also in Japan, who apparently actually replaced the rotary engine with a forward power plant for some reason before selling the car to a South African collector in 1993, who subsequently left it to while away its retirement in a warehouse, shame on him, until it was sold in 2013, restored, and returned to historic racing. It sold again in 2017 at the Amelia Island Concourse auction for $1.75 million, while one chassis remained under Mazda's ownership, and the second reverted back to Mazda's ownership after it retired from its privateer racing, with chassis 002, the one that has ended up in the U.S. and underwent restoration before returning to historic competition in 2016 at the Monterey Motorsports Reunion. That brings us to the end of another video, definitely my longest single car guide, so thanks for sticking with me if indeed you have. In fact, I will leave off the standard call to action, which was in the other video, and instead ask that those of you who watched both to let me know your thoughts on which one you preferred. Obviously a lot of the same information, but this one also had a lot of extra, both informationally and a lot of extra personality in it, so feedback's appreciated. Maybe if I get to the point of starting a Patreon or something, I'll pick one car a month to do a longer video in this style as a perk for that. I don't know, just thinking out loud here. Anyway, as always, thank you for your time this evening or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I wish you all a good night and a good tomorrow.